Hi, today's the 20th of February 2018 here in New Zealand, and we're just about to have a cyclone smack into part of the country later today, but the area I live in is going to miss it. So I want to talk to you today about the truth about pressing on the sacrum to relieve back pains. This actually started probably the late 1980s. When I gave birth in 1970, people had no concern at all, didn't think about posterior babies. 99% of posterior babies turn before birth spontaneously or during labor or in second stage. And women who had babies whose back were to your belly still had back labor. So posterior babies, nobody was trying to spin them or turn them or get them into an optimal fetal positioning, and back labor just wasn't one of those things that was particularly focused on. If you had back labor, you had back labor, and if you had belly labor, you had belly labor, or if you had labor coming down your legs, or you vomited, that was just part of what happened. But in the late 1980s, and because at that point I lived in the United States and these skills developed in the early 70s as I worked with hundreds of ordinary families about it, then we began to hear more about back labor, and it was specifically associated to home births, and it was specifically associated to the concept of continuity of care. So there were no midwives in the United States legally, but there were a lot of people doing births. And there were what were called lay midwives, and there were some obstetricians and some obstetrical nurses, and a lot of Vietnam paramedics who had come back from the war were doing births as well. And what would happen is that these very caring birth providers would stay at a woman's birth. This was one of the discussions around birth, was that women were left alone in the hospital and that you should have continuity of care. You should have somebody who stays with you. So if you have one person who's staying with you throughout labor, if your labor goes on beyond 8 hours or 12 hours or 15 hours or 24 hours, or it's a niggling labor but you want company and it goes on for 36 hours or 48 hours, or the prize that women sometimes elevate themselves to. I had a 72-hour labor. Well, no, they didn't, but that's another conversation. So the issue about back labor and longer labors came up directly in relationship to this concept that people were trying to put forward, which was continuity of care midwifery and someone staying with you. And they got tired. It was as simple as that. And they wanted to get labor going. They wanted to relieve the pain because back laborers niggle. They just niggle. They go on and on. You often don't even feel a change between one contraction to the next, and they're exhausting. And it doesn't matter which position your baby's in. Back labor is a drag, so to speak. So from that, caring people decided that if you pressed on the sacrum, then it would relieve some of the discomfort women had. And the other one was to get on hands and knees. So in the Debunking the Myths series, I talked about that. So now I wanted to do the Truth series. So the truth about the sacrum. And this is what we discovered. I'm not a midwife. I don't have a background in anatomy and physiology. I just did hands-on body work. And people who are midwives or doctors or obstetrical nurses or Vietnam paramedics, even today, they're not body workers. They know anatomy and physiology, but they're not body workers. And people have not been thinking about the relationship of this big object into the container of a woman's body to understand what happens. You have this big object, and it has to come through this bony tube. This bony tube has parts to it. It has the sacrum, which is at the end of the spine, a triangle. It has these two big hip blades. They overlap the sacrum. You can see it. I don't have to take anatomy and physiology to take a look at a pelvis. So you see the two bumps overlapping the sacrum. You see the hip bones. You see where the legs come into the hip bones. You see that those two bones wrap around to make each part of the pubic bone. And then you see that you have a little tailbone. So this bony pelvis has 4 parts. And these 4 parts move in their own unique way. The sacrum is the bone that moves the easiest from the viewpoint of the baby. So if the baby needs space, in other words, if its size relative to the inside of that woman's pelvis is snug, or she has tension in there because the bones are covered with soft tissue, then the baby can push from the inside and push the sacrum out. And because the nerves from your brain go down your spine, not your belly, they go through the little holes in the sacrum that you can see, then go down to your legs. When those nerves are pressed, it elicits pain, which is back labor. So the idea was to reduce pain. So does that make sense? If the baby's trying to push the sacrum out, is reducing pain the true goal? That was what people came up with. Yes, it was. Whereas Birthing Better families came up with, no, it's not, right? What we came up with is the true goal is to move the sacrum, mobilize the sacrum, help the baby create space, or mobilize the other bones, the hip bones, which are done very specifically. And we have a video segment on how to do a hip lift, which is basically a woman has to lie down, and she gets pillows under her belly and between her legs so she's comfy. And then you place your hand on the hip blade, not the waist, on the hip blade, and then she helps you find the bone she sits on, because that's below where the leg meets the hip, and then you gently push down on the hip blade and up on the leg, because that's how the hip bones move. They move like a seesaw, a teeter-totter, but you do it gently. And women can feel, and men can, you can do this on men, they feel it as well. They feel the space inside their pelvis open up. And when they tense up lightly, so you even can't see it, somewhere, doesn't matter where, because we are all connected. As soon as a woman tenses up and you try doing that again, or a man tenses up because the same thing happens as his body, that space isn't created as easily, which taught us that internal tension, not external tension, internal tension can stop these bones from moving. So we had to learn the skills to reduce internal tension. So when a baby is pushing on the sacrum and producing back labor, it also produces back labor in a specific place. Women can tell you where it is. So if women can tell us where the tension is, then we can help reduce the tension right there when we learn the skills. And when I say we, do I mean people who are birth professionals? No, I mean we, right? The mothers and fathers. Women can move their sacrum. We have an exercise called Kate's Cat, which is quite simple. You stand up, relax your knees, you think about your sacrum, which is that triangle at the base of your spine, and you try to tuck your tail under, inside, between your legs a little bit more. And if you can't imagine that or do that, then think about where your rectum is when you're just standing up, and instead try to point your rectum down to the floor. And then push back and try to point your rectum toward the back wall. And that articulates your sacrum. When you point your rectum to the ground, that creates more space at the top of your pelvis. And when you point your rectum toward the back wall as much as you can, that opens up the middle and the bottom space of the pelvis. And when you combine that with a hip lift, you create a lot of space for this baby to move down a little bit more. And after you do a hip lift, it's really important that a woman gets upright so that the baby takes advantage of gravity. So we learned to create space in the pelvis to deal with back labor. And what it did was that the pain would then move down a little bit. And that would tell us that the baby had moved down a little bit, but that next place still had tension. And once the baby moved down sufficiently, got the widest part of its head or its presenting part through the narrowest or the most tense part of our pelvis, the back labor went away. So we knew that pressing on the sacrum was first exhausting to the person who was doing it. It relieved pain for a small amount of time, but only if you kept doing it. But most importantly, it closed off the space the baby was trying to create, which meant that birthing better families, as we developed these skills, the reason we developed them is people would come in, and I'd see them, and they'd talk about their birth, and they'd say, you know, I did this for hours and hours and hours and hours. My husband pressed on my sacrum for hours and hours and hours. And the birth just went on for hours and hours and hours and hours. And after he pressed on my sacrum for 11 hours, he was useless once the baby was born. And I don't know if it helped. It helped reduce some of the pain, but the labor went on for hours and hours and hours and hours. And so we knew that pressing on the sacrum exhausted the person who was doing it. That's not good. You don't want to have a skill that does that. And we knew that women didn't feel that pressing on the sacrum speeded up the birth and resolved the problem. So we knew that wasn't good. We knew that pressing on the sacrum made no sense. And the reason it was developed was because the people who developed it didn't have an understanding, a functional understanding of a big object coming through our body as a container. There's no blame, shame, or guilt about that. There's a lot of things that we as women have told each other. The favorite one that we discovered was what I was taught and you were taught, which is do pelvic floor exercises for birth to strengthen your muscles so you can push out your baby. That is nonsense. Absolutely not only nonsense, but it has probably caused more delayed births than anything anybody has done, with some other exceptions, like sitting up lying down to give birth we don't necessarily like, but when you sit up and you compress the sacrum to the bed, it's very hard for the baby to come down and out because its space is closed off. And we don't even think about it. We do not think about the relationship of the baby to our body. And we have to start doing that. And that's why our trust and all the Birthing Better families who developed these skills in the early 70s and the tens of thousands who have used these skills throughout the world, it made sense to them, and particularly to men. Men understand birth now as an exercise in plumbing. You've got to get a big object out of the container. The container has to open up a closed thing called a cervix. That has to open up, so you don't want there to be tension to do that. It has to come through this bony tube, so you want to create space if you need to. And then it has to come through this 3-inch soft tissue tube, so you should massage all the way inside that 3-inch soft tissue tube so that tissue becomes pliable and open, and when this big object comes through, the big object isn't stretching it, it's opening. This tissue is giving an opening to this big object. Men get it, so they love doing the Birthing Better skills because they're practical skills. And women finally feel their body, understand their body without having to anatomically know it. We don't have to know any of the names of the parts of our body to feel whether, if we press on our hip blade and pull up slightly on our sit bone, whether we can feel space created. We don't have to know any of the terms. It's just that the sacrum has that term. It's the common language of it. So what can you do to help grow a skilled birthing population? Tell everybody about these videos and direct them to our YouTube channel, Birthing Better Childbirth Preparation. We have a playlist on all the myths around childbirth And every myth around childbirth has a truth about it. And this is why I decided to do these 2 series. So the truth about pressing on the sacrum is no, don't do that as a way to create space for your baby, because your baby is telling you it needs space if it is hung up and causing you to have discomfort in your back. Instead, you need to learn to create space for your baby. You can try to relieve pain, but you need to relieve pain by creating space and helping your baby get through your body and move down from where it's stuck. It's as simple as that. So you can donate to our charitable trust, because all proceeds from the sale of Birthing Better go directly to our charitable trust, so that we can further the vision of these hundreds of families who created these phenomenal skills. And just go to PayPal and give a donation at info@birthingbetter.com. Also, like this on our Facebook page, Birthing Better Childbirth Preparation on Facebook, and share it from this page to other social media pages that you follow. If you're pregnant now, purchase one of the resources, or get in touch with us and we'll give you a discount to do that. Comment. What do you want us to talk about? How can we help you change the conversation around childbirth, one person at a time? Because right now, it's nuts. We have a huge amount of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, frustration around the childbirth experience. We have more women choosing elective cesareans because they lack the skills. We have fathers less engaged because they were told to be support people rather than coaching. We use the word giving birth, which is blah, instead of saying we have to do the activity of birthing our baby, which gives us a hint we should have skills to do the activity. So see you tomorrow, and thanks so much for listening to this talk on the truth about pressing on the sacrum. Bye-bye.